They thought your silence was weakness. They mistook your compassion for compliance. But what they never understood is that the storm within the empath is not chaos. It is awakening. And when that awakening comes, it doesn't scream. It ends things in silence. An empath is often seen as a gentle soul, someone who senses the emotional undercurrents in others and instinctively moves to soothe, heal, and stabilize. They operate from a place of deep feeling, of compassion, and often from a subconscious fear of abandonment or disconnection. In this way, they have spent their lives disowning their own power, their anger, and their right to resist. But what begins as love often becomes silent suffering, and what starts as understanding becomes silent suffering. The empath bends, stretches, and compromises, not because they are weak, but because they are conditioned to equate peace with self-neglect. Over time, the empath unconsciously enters into a pattern of self-erasure, rationalizing mistreatment, tolerating manipulation, and absorbing the emotional debris of another, particularly the narcissist, who senses this dynamic as fertile ground for control. The narcissist, in contrast, thrives on attention, affirmation, and dominance. They interpret kindness as weakness and sensitivity as a gateway. Their charm is often calculated, their vulnerability rehearsed, and their chaos contagious. They seek out empaths, because empaths are willing to carry emotional weight that doesn't belong to them. And for a time this works. The empath absorbs insult as injury, hoping their patience will inspire change. They make excuses, forgive without justice, and stay long past the expiration of dignity. But what the narcissist doesn't see, what they never account for, is the slow accumulation of disowned emotion, the quiet building of the empath's shadow. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is the unconscious part of the psyche that contains everything we repress: our anger, our needs, our power, our capacity for destruction. For the empath, the shadow is formed not from cruelty, but from the refusal to protect oneself. Every time the empath allows a boundary to be crossed, every time they silence their instincts in favor of keeping the peace, another part of them retreats into the unconscious. There it simmers, not with resentment alone, but with primal strength, the will to survive, and the buried right to say, no more. The empath's shadow becomes the storehouse of their denied self, and the more they are pushed, the more this self prepares for emergence. This emergence is not explosive, it is tectonic. It does not erupt as drama, but awakens as clarity. One day the empath no longer feels confused. One day the tears stop not because they've healed, but because they've seen the pattern clearly. They are no longer asking why the narcissist behaves the way they do. They are asking why they accepted it. This shift marks the beginning of their inner reckoning. The shadow steps forward, not as a monster, but as an ally. It brings the empath their voice, their rage, and their right to exist fully, not as an extension of someone else, but as a whole being. Now the dynamic changes. The narcissist, who depended on the empath's silence, no longer receives the same responses. The empathy has not disappeared. It has simply been redirected inward. The empath stops participating in the game. They speak truth, not to argue, but to declare. They walk away, not to punish, but to preserve. And because the narcissist has no concept of internal strength that is neither loud nor violent, they find themselves blindsided. The person they thought would never leave, never fight, never resist, suddenly does. And not with chaos, but with certainty. This is why the fed-up empath becomes so dangerous, because their transformation is internal, rooted in psychological integration, and no longer subject to emotional control. The narcissist's entire psychological framework is built on projection. They cannot face their own inner fragmentation, so they unconsciously cast it onto others. Their shame becomes someone else's fault. Their failure, someone else's betrayal. Their rage, someone else's provocation. This is not done deliberately in most cases. It is a survival strategy of the ego, an act of psychological displacement to preserve an image of superiority and self-righteousness. The empath, being highly attuned to emotional undercurrents and conditioned to seek harmony over conflict, becomes the perfect recipient of these projections. They absorb them without resistance, not realizing that they are taking ownership of wounds that were never theirs to carry. In doing so, the empath becomes a mirror, not of truth, but of the narcissist's delusions. The narcissist looks into them and sees what they want to see: a willing servant, an emotional sponge, a selfless giver who will never rebel. But this projection is only effective as long as the empath remains unconscious of it. The moment the empath awakens to the manipulation, when they begin to see the distortion, the gaslighting, the emotional role reversal, the illusion begins to crumble. What the narcissist failed to realize is that every projection is a double-edged sword. It may relieve them temporarily, but it also makes them dependent on the other person's compliance. Once the empath refuses to comply, once they stop believing they are the problem, the narcissist's entire emotional defense begins to collapse. The mirror they use to stabilize their false self becomes reflective of reality, and reality is the one thing the narcissist cannot face without fragmenting further. This collapse is not dramatic in external form, but it is seismic within the narcissist's psyche. They begin to lose control, not just over the empath, but over the narrative they have used to define themselves. They no longer see the same obedient figure before them. The empath now speaks with clarity, stands with boundaries, and no longer reacts in ways that feed the narcissist's superiority. There are no more emotional outbursts to exploit, no more apologies to accept, no more desperate attempts to please. The empath becomes psychologically still, and in that stillness, the narcissist sees something they've avoided all their life: their own reflection. This reflection is brutal. It shows them the harm they've caused, the manipulation they've engaged in, and the emptiness they've tried to cover with control. The empath, by refusing to absorb any more projections, becomes a kind of psychological reckoning. Their lack of reaction forces the narcissist into confrontation with themselves, and because the narcissist lacks the emotional tools to process shame, regret, or vulnerability without turning it outward, they begin to unravel. They search for new targets, try to provoke, to manipulate, to restore the projection system, but it no longer works. The empath is no longer playing the role. They have seen through the performance. They have detached from the false mirror. Jung believed that the path to wholeness required us to reclaim our projections and integrate the shadow they represent. For the empath, this moment of awakening is the first step toward that integration. For the narcissist, however, this moment can be shattering. They are left with themselves, unfiltered, exposed, and unsupported. The one person who kept their fragile ego afloat, the empath has stepped away, not in hatred, but in truth. And truth is the one force the narcissist cannot manipulate. In this way, the empath becomes dangerous, not by intention, but by evolution. Their awakening is not a war cry, but a mirror, and what it reflects is the very thing the narcissist spent their life running from. The empath's journey from emotional captivity to liberation is not merely a shift in behavior, but a profound psychological transformation rooted in the process Carl Jung called individuation. At the core of this transformation lies the breaking of the trauma bond, a psychological and emotional tether formed through cycles of abuse, inconsistency, and intermittent reinforcement. The empath, initially drawn into this cycle, often confuses chaos with connection, believing that their role is to fix, heal, or endure. The narcissist perpetuates this dynamic by alternately offering affection and withdrawal, validation and devaluation, which keeps the empath psychologically dependent, always seeking approval, always striving to prove their worth. This cycle feeds on emotional confusion and guilt, training the empath to betray themselves in order to preserve a fragile, one-sided bond. Individuation begins the moment the empath starts to question the narrative they've accepted about themselves. The empath has long been conditioned to believe that their worth is measured by their usefulness to others, their ability to keep peace, their willingness to absorb pain without complaint. But the cracks begin to form when the empath experiences an inner conflict, a small, persistent voice that whispers truths they've long ignored. This voice does not come from the outer world but from the self, the deeper unconscious aspect of the psyche that knows who they truly are beneath the conditioning, the masks, and the false responsibilities. This is the soul's protest against the lie of powerlessness. As the empath begins to listen to this voice, they undergo the first phase of individuation, the confrontation with the false self. They begin to see how much of their identity was constructed around someone else's emotional needs. They start to recognize the ways they have minimized their own pain, justified mistreatment, and accepted guilt for things they didn't cause. This is not an intellectual realization. It is an existential awakening. It comes with grief, disorientation, and a mourning of the years spent lost in someone else's illusion. But with this grief also comes clarity. The empath is no longer content to live in emotional servitude. They stop reacting to manipulation. They stop chasing love that must be earned. They begin to detach, not just physically, but energetically. In breaking the trauma bond, the empath reclaims emotional autonomy. They understand that love is not meant to be a transaction of suffering. They realize that empathy, when unguarded, can become a weapon turned inward. And so, they begin to discern. They establish boundaries, not as acts of retaliation, but as declarations of self-worth. They walk away from roles that demanded their silence. They cease to explain their value. This psychological detachment terrifies the narcissist, who has built their entire illusion of superiority on the empath's dependency. Without the empath's emotional participation, the narcissist is left to face the void of their own unintegrated self. The empath, in contrast, is now on the path of integration. They are no longer fragmented by guilt or swayed by the emotional chaos of others. They begin to access their inner authority, the part of the psyche that stands rooted in truth rather than fear. The world that once felt threatening now becomes a mirror for their inner growth. They are no longer trapped in cycles of pleasing and proving. They have returned to themselves. This return is not loud or vengeful. It is silent, grounded, and transformative. It is the quiet power of someone who no longer needs permission to exist. The empath has not become hard, but whole. They have not abandoned empathy, but directed it inward. In doing so, they render the narcissist powerless, not through confrontation, but through disconnection. This is individuation, the death of the false self and the birth of the authentic soul. Pain is the language of transformation, and for the empath it is also the beginning of alchemy. What begins as confusion, betrayal, and emotional depletion slowly becomes the raw material for something greater. At first, the empath internalizes the pain, believing it is their fault. believing they weren't enough, believing they simply need to love harder. But over time, the pain compounds and begins to take on a different shape. It no longer feels like something to be endured, but something that demands recognition. This shift marks the start of the alchemical process, the transmutation of emotional suffering into inner power. It is not a process of escaping the wound, but of descending into it, mining its meaning, and reclaiming the pieces of self that were scattered through years of self-denial. In Jungian thought, transformation does not occur through denial or avoidance, but through conscious confrontation with the unconscious. The empath, who has long survived by suppressing their anger and instincts, begins to make contact with what they've buried. The emotional exhaustion becomes a threshold. They stop asking how to save the other and begin asking what parts of themselves they've lost. Every flash of anger, every wave of grief, every surge of resentment becomes a guidepost. These emotions are not signs of failure, but invitations to wholeness. The empath begins to see that the pain was not punishment, but the soul's demand for integrity. It is in this fire that the false identity, the one built around pleasing, enduring, and sacrificing, burns away. Through this fire, the empath does not become cruel but clear. They no longer accept distorted versions of love that require their erasure. They no longer confuse patience with permission or silence with virtue. The pain that once kept them captive now fuels their emergence. Their identity, once molded to accommodate others, is reforged in authenticity. They realize they were never weak for caring, only unprotected. Now they begin to protect themselves. They begin to speak not to be heard by others, but to hear themselves. Every time they say no, every time they walk away, every time they stop explaining, a part of their soul returns. This clarity is not loud or aggressive. It doesn't need to be. It radiates from the center of the self like quiet fire. The empath no longer seeks closure from the narcissist, because they have become their own resolution. They no longer crave validation, because they have validated their own experience. They no longer demand justice from the person who hurt them, because they have found inner balance. This is the essence of alchemy. The pain that once threatened to destroy them now becomes the source of their power. They are not seeking revenge. They are seeking peace. And in that pursuit, they become something entirely unrecognizable to the narcissist. The narcissist, who fed on the empath's emotional dependence, finds nothing left to exploit. The empath does not retaliate. They simply disappear from the game. They do not chase, explain, or justify. They have nothing to prove and no role to play. They have transcended the cycle. Their power lies not in becoming like the narcissist, but in becoming fully themselves. The alchemical fire has purified their intentions, exposed their illusions, and revealed their strength. They no longer operate from fear, but from presence. They have not become cold. They have become sovereign. And this sovereignty, rooted in pain turned to wisdom, is what makes them truly dangerous to those who once mistook their kindness for weakness. The empath often begins their journey heavily identified with the nurturing, receptive qualities of the psyche, what Jung referred to as the anima. These are the qualities of softness, sensitivity, intuition, and emotional attunement. While these aspects are powerful in their own right, when left unbalanced by the assertive, structured energy of the animus, the inner masculine, the empath becomes overly accommodating, self-sacrificing, and vulnerable to exploitation. The narcissist unconsciously recognizes this imbalance and capitalizes on it, inserting themselves as the dominant force, effectively hijacking the role of the empath's unclaimed inner masculine. This creates a toxic dynamic where the narcissist becomes the authority and the empath remains the emotional caretaker, unable to assert boundaries or protect their own energy. As the empath continues to endure the emotional volatility and manipulation that define the narcissistic relationship, they are forced into confrontation with their disowned inner masculine. The very act of survival begins to awaken the parts of them that have long been suppressed, the part that says, "Enough," the part that demands respect, the part that understands the necessity of boundary, discipline, and detachment. This is not a conscious decision at first. It often emerges as irritation, fatigue, or moments of uncharacteristic anger. But beneath these expressions lies something deeper, the soul reclaiming its ability to defend itself. The empath starts to realize that love without self-respect is not love, and compassion without discernment is self-betrayal. This realization marks the beginning of the return of the animus. The animus is not about aggression or dominance. It is the inner function that allows an individual to act, to define, to separate themselves from others when necessary, and to claim their space in the world. As the empath begins to integrate this force, they stop seeking permission to assert themselves. They stop justifying their pain. They no longer remain passive in the face of injustice. Instead, they act with clarity and purpose. They begin to embody structure and direction. Their emotional intuition is now paired with inner authority. They know what they feel and why it matters. They know what they need and are no longer afraid to demand it or walk away when it's denied. This inner shift destabilizes the narcissist, who has come to depend on the empath's unguarded emotional access. The empath no longer responds to guilt tactics or emotional manipulation. They do not flinch when the narcissist withholds affection or throws tantrums. They recognize these patterns for what they are, distractions from truth. With the animus integrated, the empath does not need external validation to confirm their worth. They become self-referencing. Their energy no longer leaks out toward chaos. It flows inward, supporting their own healing and growth. The narcissist, who once played the role of emotional puppeteer, finds their strings cut and their illusions exposed. This union of the anima and animus within the empath creates a psychological balance that renders them untouchable. They are no longer polarized. They are whole. They do not need to become cold or distant to protect themselves. They are grounded in their own presence. They can feel deeply without being overwhelmed, love fully without losing themselves, and care for others without abandoning their own needs. This makes them powerful in a way the narcissist never anticipated. The empath is no longer the wounded healer, but the integrated soul, no longer desperate for connection, but discerning of it. And the narcissist, who once believed they had found an eternal source of validation, now stands before someone they can no longer control, predict, or define. The empath has become sovereign, and sovereignty cannot be manipulated. The empath's journey through emotional exploitation is often marked by the unconscious adoption of a role, a persona constructed to maintain connection, preserve harmony, and minimize conflict. This role becomes a psychological mask, one that says, "I am the caretaker, I am the understanding one, I am the peacemaker." It is not the authentic self, but a survival identity created in response to repeated emotional threats and manipulations. The narcissist relies on this mask. They don't see the true soul behind it, only the behavior it performs, the forgiveness that comes too quickly, the silence that comes too often, the loyalty that resists logic. For as long as the empath wears this mask, they are caught in a role scripted by the narcissist's needs. Their emotions are edited, their voice is toned down, and their reactions are shaped to avoid punishment or abandonment. But the mask cannot be worn forever. Something begins to fracture. It often starts in moments of quiet, when the empath is alone with their thoughts, their pain, their exhaustion. The performance begins to falter, not because they are becoming weaker, but because they are beginning to awaken. The empath starts asking questions they once feared to ask. Who am I outside of this role? Why do I keep sacrificing my peace for someone else's comfort? What would happen if I stopped? These questions don't destroy the empath. They begin to reconstruct them. The persona starts to crack, and through those cracks, something deeper emerges. Not rebellion, not cruelty, truth. Jung believed that every persona we adopt eventually limits the growth of the soul. It serves a purpose for a time, protection, adaptation, acceptance, but the longer it is worn, the more it obscures the self. The empath, once bound by this mask, begins to feel the pressure of the authentic self beneath it. They feel rage and no longer suppress it. They feel sadness and no longer disguise it as calm. They feel disgust and no longer reframe it as compassion. Each reclaimed emotion is a piece of their soul returning. Each honest reaction is a step away from illusion and closer to integration. As the mask is shed, the empath stops participating in the narcissist's script. They stop responding the way they're expected to. They no longer provide emotional cover for the narcissist's dysfunction. They no longer soften their truth to preserve the illusion of peace. Their responses become unscripted, raw, and self-defined. This change confuses the narcissist, who depended not on the real empath, but on the predictable role they played. The narcissist finds themselves engaging with someone they do not recognize, not because the empath has changed personalities, but because they've stopped hiding behind one. The return to the true self is not loud. It is not a dramatic unveiling. It is quiet, grounded, and firm. The empath does not announce their transformation. They simply act from it. They say no when needed. They walk away when disrespected. They speak without over-explaining. Their power lies in simplicity, in alignment, in consistency. They are no longer tethered to chaos, nor addicted to emotional turbulence. Their worth is no longer defined by what they give others, but by how deeply they remain connected to their own truth. To the narcissist, this makes the empath dangerous, not because they've become cruel or vindictive, but because they've become real. They cannot be manipulated by illusion because they no longer live in one. They cannot be guilted into submission because they are no longer wearing the mask of guilt. They have nothing to prove and no fear of rejection, for they have rejected the false self that once kept them trapped. This is not revenge. This is reclamation. The empath has not become someone new. They have become who they were before they were taught to play a role. And this authentic self, rooted in inner clarity, is beyond the narcissist's reach. The fed-up empath is not dangerous because they seek to harm, but because they've awakened to the truth. No longer bound by illusion, no longer trapped in cycles of approval, no longer carrying guilt that isn't theirs. They return to themselves, whole and indivisible. The very qualities the narcissist once exploited, empathy, loyalty, sensitivity, are now guided by wisdom and protected by boundary. This transformation is not vengeance. It is individuation. It is the reclamation of the self from the wreckage of projection and control. And in that reclamation, the empath becomes the one thing the narcissist never anticipated: untouchable.